Okay, this video is how to know truth, quotes and concepts. And where this stuff with all these quotes arose from was, I had a real nice social life and well-rounded life all through senior high school, and then I went to college at Stanford, and I was kind of real socially isolated. I pretty much just wrestled and studied, didn't do a whole lot more than that, and studied biology, did a lot of nature stuff. I was considered being a field biologist. Anyways, then when I came home, my family would tease me a lot about being socially awkward and almost a little Asperger autistic, okay? And so part of what I did in response to that was I noticed that no one really cared about all these scientific things I was interested in, but they loved, talking jokes, and I wanted to be a better speaker and stuff. So I started to memorize quotes and jokes, and I collected them ever since that time. And I've got like over 4,000 pages of quotes, and I got tons of jokes too. But anyways, as far as quotes here, I had them organized in categories as well as alphabetized. I wrote a book about quotes, only about 800 pages long, a couple of years ago. But anyways, how to know truth, quotes and concepts. So we're going to explore many different perspectives on knowing truth, and it's very relevant because, every day you got to figure out if something's true or not, and your life depends on it, because if you make good decisions based on correct information, you'll be more likely to be healthy and happy and successful versus if you don't. So anyways, here's the first quote by Oscar Wilde. Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth. So that's a reason why I think it's good that all these people have these like fake names on the internet, because if they use it to do good things and to tell the truth about something. On the other hand, if they're bad and they're being nasty or dishonest, trolling and all that, you can always block them from the YouTube channel, from Facebook, from whatever the social media site is. But on the other hand, you're more likely to hear people say honest stuff if they feel more comfortable saying it. And anonymity makes people more comfortable to say what they really think. Okay, so here's Richard Rorty's quote. And by the way, I have the date of their lives on here for if you want to study any of the quotes of these authors here. Okay, Richard Rorty says, truth is what your contemporaries let you get away with. And that is very true. For example, as a doctor, there's lots of things I can't really say to you. People would be offended if I said them to you. But I tell you as much as I can and try to help you as best I can. Truth is found in the emergent synthesis that reconciles the thesis and the antithesis, the thesis and the antithesis. So that's the Hegelian dialect, the idea of one person has a thesis, the first idea or explanation for something, the second person has the antithesis, antithesis, and you can combine them into a new synthesis. And that's sort of the ideal of thinking and learning, that you can put the two old ways of viewing something and combine them together into a new third way that's better. But in reality, a lot of times it's one or the other. And that comes out of Kierkegaard, yes or no. And basically he says you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. And things like that. So in life we often have to decide and choose. Okay, here's a quote by Nietzsche. Fully mature intellects love truth, even when it appears plain and simple, boring to the ordinary person. For they have noticed that truth tends to reveal its highest wisdom in the guise of simplicity. And that is very true. For example, out of all these years I've been studying biology, I'm 59. I started studying biology in an intense way ever since about I was 18 years old. So that's many years. Gosh, what is that, about 40 years or something? So anyways, I can tell you the most valuable thing I ever learned in all of med school, residency, and post-residency, post-fellowship, all that stuff, was human beings are designed to eat starch. And I would also say fruits. So as simple as that is, and that's why that's another reason why I think McDougall's the best of nutrition doctors, is because he gave a coherent method and rationale for everything, okay? I think I've gone way beyond what he does in terms of biochemistry, molecular biology, and all that. But McDougall, man, he put it all together in a coherent framework, and he's got incredible clinical experience. He's been doing that, ever since he was a young guy. And all the testimonials on his website, all the newsletters, I think that's all great, okay? So anyways, the next thing, he kind of talks, though, at the level of a patient, an average patient, get out of your fatness and misery, whereas I'm more like trying to take, the smart people to their maximum potential. So our points of view are very complementary, I think. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit, what does Aristotle have to say about the truth? Oh, first of all, Abelard. Abelard was a great Aristotelian philosopher of the Middle Ages. Him and Thomas Aquinas were the two great minds of the Middle Ages, I think. Okay, so Abelard says, by doubting we are led to question, and by questioning we arrive at the truth. The key to increasing knowledge is persistent questioning. Questioning is the beginning of wisdom. Yeah, so you should be skeptical. Smart people are skeptical. The average chump believes what they hear. They believe, oh, this expert's from some fancy university or something. I got news for you. A lot of times, the fancier the university or the foundation, the more likely they're BSing you, okay? I've been in a lot of those places. Most modern so-called experts are just phonies, and they're just advertising something for some company. So being skeptical is in your best interest for your knowledge, your wisdom, your health, etc. Okay, Aristotle now. The highest activity of man is the pursuit of truth. The life of intellect is most pleasant and the best life, because it is the intellect which is unique about man. The greatest of all pleasures is the pleasure of learning and contemplation, because it is continuous and enduring. Unlike the other pleasures, it does not wax and wane. Yeah, you can enjoy reading and thinking and intelligent conversations all day long, watching nice videos all day long, versus other pleasures like eating and the other fun things we do, they don't last that long. Okay? Aristotle continues. Poetry, or we'll say story, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, for example, the Greek plays, is more worthy of serious attention than is history. History treats particular facts. Poetry is concerned with universal truths. History only tells us what has been. Poetry tells us how things ought to be. And I first became aware of this quote from reading Ayn Rand, and she makes this point as well about Aristotle. That's the idea of it gives a person something to aspire to. Well, I can be great like such and such a person was in this play or this story. And that's a guiding light to focus your energy in your life, and it really will help you. A lot of times history is written in sort of a mundane, dull way of just dates and stuff and battles and all that. And it's so anyways, there's a lot to be learned from history, but a good novel and story like, Les Miserables, The Great Man, Jean Valjean, okay, Christmas Carol, The Redemption of Scrooge, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the sort of wonderful person in Alyosha, for example. All those things we really learn from them. Okay, the proof that you know something is that you could teach it. Yep, teaching it is how you learn it better. And okay, courage is the first of the human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees the others. Yep, this is all Aristotle, by the way. Yeah, if a person's too much of a chicken, then they can't do anything. Aristotle continues, the high-minded man must care more for truth than for what people think. And then here's one I love by Aristotle. And this is how Aristotle gets you to think. He says, when we think in pictures. We speculate in pictures. And I thought, wow, what a interesting thing to say. Again, you think about it, it totally makes sense. Look about your dog. Your dog knows you. It knows your personality. It knows your mood. It knows your habits. Your dog doesn't have words, but it figures that all out. And therefore, it seems reasonable that humans think in pictures too, most likely. I think we do. And therefore, we should teach with pictures. And the picture's even better when you put it into a story form. And just think about the Middle Ages, all the illiterate peasants. They learned Christianity from looking at the pictures and the stories along the walls painted in the Catholic churches and cathedrals. And here's this guy, Karen Egan and Gillian Judson from Imagination and the Engaged Learner, where they talk about the benefit of fairy tales and other stories. A story makes it easier to remember the topic. And the story tells a student how to feel or think about the topic. So the bottom line is, the best teaching is seeing pictures in a coherent, plausible story. Then everything makes sense and we learn it faster. And so a lot of effort should be put into, how do we help people to learn faster and how do they help themselves to learn faster? Okay, now we're going to talk about Socrates and Plato briefly on the topic of truth. This comes primarily from this book by Arthur Herman called The Light in the Cave. I've read a ton of stuff about the ancient Greeks. This is the best book ever written on the ancient Greeks called The Light in the Cave. And basically the cave alludes to Plato's allegory about the cave. And the light, you can think of it as being Socrates or even better, Aristotle, showing people a way out of the cave, up into the light. Okay, so here he goes. Arthur Herman's writing. The Socratic method entails thorough questioning and applying reason to the answers. Later, Plato elaborated the method into a formal procedure called the dialectic. The dialectic is in effect our ticket out of the cave. When one tries to get at what each thing is in itself, Plato has Socrates say in the Republic, by asking the inconvenient questions and sifting through the answers and relying on reason without any aid from the senses, then he has mastered the dialectic. Okay, so the question and answer method of working to the truth. He will stand at the summit of the intellectual realm, just like the man who stood on the mountaintop after escaping from the cave and saw the sun, and he will see the good in itself. By an act of pure thought, he will know the truth, and he will be prepared to act on it. He will be ready to change the world in the light of the truth, and a higher reality. So that's good stuff. Escaping from the cave and teaching people and helping people. Truth on Plato's terms is reserved for the tiny minority of those trained in the rigors of the dialectic, and to those who are ready to make the same arduous climb up out of the cave. Okay, and so that's, like I said, it's also a book about the whole history of Western civilization, continually comparing the perspective of Plato, which is somewhat collectivist, versus that of Aristotle, which much more promoted individualism. Okay, the importance of truth. We can only do the best we can based on what we know, and that is why the truth is so important, from Terry Goodkind. Okay, now here's a quote from Harry Brown in his book, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World. To be able to predict the consequences of our actions depends upon our ability to perceive the true identity of things and of people. So truth is important. It's not an end in itself. The truth is always a means to an end. The purpose of knowing the truth is to be able to make it work for you. You need the truth in order to be able to deal with things as they are and to get predictable results. You may want to know the truth of a particular mechanical cause and effect relationship so you can fix your car. The principle is always the same. You want the truth so you can use it to produce a consequence that you want. Truth is information that leads to predictable results. The test to be applied to an idea is, does it work? Okay? And that's a little bit like William James, pragmatism theory of truth, but still it helps you to work towards it, because you basically accumulate metaphors about the truth and then you apply them as appropriate to your context. And being able to tweak your thinking and analyze your thinking in fine detail, it makes you smarter. Okay, so here's skepticism. And these are a couple anonymous quotes. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And now it's almost like we're talking about nutrition research. Whenever you got one of these profitable foods, there's always going to be some big money company that just pays off a bunch of fake studies. So that's why there's so much fake studies about things like caffeine and all this other stuff. Okay, when big money talks, the truth shuts up. Freedom of speech is the power of the poor. That's really true. The poor people, that's the main thing. That's one of the main things they got going for them when they have freedom of speech. That's why it's so important for them to have that. He who is absent is always wrong. Yeah, you want to be present if something important is going down. Okay, anonymous. The golden rule means that he who has the gold makes the rules. Okay, here's a good one. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. That ends up being a very useful thing. Okay, here's Thomas Berger, the author of Little Big Man. He wrote, "The art and science of asking questions is the source of all knowledge. The truth is always made up of little particulars which sound ridiculous when repeated." And that's another reason why I think it's good to spend time reading a lot and to learn how to write well. Because what I have seen in my life experience is that people who don't read a lot and who are not very articulate, they get screwed over a lot of times in life. And they simply don't have the verbal skills or the practice of thinking skills to articulate their situation. Even though they've been treated unfairly, they just can't articulate it or write it well enough that they just get screwed over. Okay? Versus as somebody who's really articulate gets screwed over, they're much more able to verbally defend themselves or to write. So it's good to have that skill. Plus, a person who learns how to speak and write well, they're going to be better able to tell jokes and make other people laugh and have fun with that. So it's highly worthwhile to develop one's verbal skills, and it's easy to do. Just listen to an audiobook when you're driving instead of listening to beat music. And if you want to listen, okay, we're not going to get into all that. All right, let's go some more on skepticism. Skepticism, not cleanliness, is next to godliness. Okay, this is coming from Jerry Spence. This guy was like a genius lawyer, and he wrote a really good book about speaking. He's good. Okay, so anyways, Jerry Spence continues. Skepticism is the father of freedom. It is the pry that holds open the door to let the truth slip in. To be credible, you must tell the truth, because this has the power of spontaneity, which is the key that unlocks the door of the listener, because it is honest. The best way to tell a story is in the present tense, because it brings into the here and now, so the listeners can project themselves into it. So that's Jerry Spence. He's a good guy to know. All right, Nietzsche. Great intellects are skeptical. A mind that aspires to great things is necessarily skeptical. And that reminds me of another Aristotle quote. He says, in order to have an intelligent conversation, we must first remove emotions. So the point of that is you got to stay objective. It's like that 6 blind men and an elephant. Let the ideas come in. Don't immediately judge. Don't immediately get emotional about anything. And then once you got all the information, then work towards figuring out what is the best way to process it. Makes you smarter. 6 blind men and an elephant. It's an old Indian proverb. It's great. You can just type that in your browser. You'll get pictures of it real fast. Okay, now writing about the truth. Orson Scott Card is an author like a lot of science fiction. Metaphors hold the most truth in the least space. Yeah, a memorable metaphor or slogan can like echo in a person's mind and be remembered forever after hearing it once. A good one. Okay, here's John Ruskin. He's the great man of the Victorian Renaissance. He's a guy who supported the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood of Painters. And he's a real uptight guy. He was sort of like Scottish, I think, Presbyterian. His mom was real sort of a Bible thumper who had him read the Bible every day. And his father was an art collector. And so he became this like brilliant, he like the best art critic in the history of the world. Okay, music when healthy is the teacher of perfect order. And when depraved is the teacher of perfect disorder. So I like the fact he's real emotional. So you can say he's over the top pain in the butt, but it also made him a great writer. And if you want to see a great speech, I think the greatest speech ever on the history of art criticism, check out John Ruskin's speech from, I'll put the link down below, John Ruskin's speech from 1853 about the Pre-Raphaelite group of artists. It's magnificent. Okay, whenever you say something in a rhyme, it's easier to remember. So Jonathan Swift here, the great Bishop of Ireland, he says, truth shines brighter clad in verse. The rhyme just makes it more memorable. It makes it more truthful, makes it more persuasive. Everybody likes rhymes, okay? Okay, Gerald Brennan, here's his quote. You can't get at the truth by writing history. Only a novelist can do that. Yeah, again, that's kind of a little bit like the Aristotelian quote. History will give you a bunch of dates and it can give you some good information, but the novelist can put it into context and get the human side of the story that makes it memorable. Okay, here's Anne Lamott. She's a good writer. I think she's American from 1954. Here she goes. You are going to feel like hell if you never write the stuff that's tugging at your sleeve and your heart. Your stories, visions, memories, songs, your truth, your version of things in your voice. That's really all you have to offer us, and it's why you were born. By the way, I think a good thing to do for parents and grandparents is to either type it or dictate it or make a video of it, their life and the family history. And you give it to the kids, to the grandkids, so your family knows it's family history. A person has a better perspective on life if they have some sense of their ancestors, where they came from, what their grandparents went through, their parents. So I highly recommend that, because a lot of times a person gets sick and they're so sick and then they just die, and the grandchildren never know what the grandparents, what their life was like. So that's a valuable thing to do. All right, anyways, Anne Lamott continues. The truth is always subversive. The writer is the person who is standing apart. Truth is about becoming conscious. When you're conscious and writing from a place of insight and simplicity and real caring about the truth, you have the ability to throw the lights on for the reader. He or she will recognize his or her life and truth in what you say, in the pictures you have painted, and this decreases the sense of isolation that which we have all had too much of. Okay, it's a great quote by Anne Lamott, and that reminds me very much of Ralph Waldo Emerson when he said, "When we speak that which is most deep and personal of ourselves, other people find that the most true and universal." So that's also like Beethoven, an artist is someone who's learned to trust himself. So all of those things resonate for producing, good, useful things to say. All right, Anne Lamott continues. Write straight into the emotional center of things. Write towards vulnerability. Risk being unliked. Good writing is about telling the truth. The truth seems to want expression. Your anger and damage and grief are a way to tell the truth. Tell the truth as you understand it. It is your writer. If you're a writer, you have a moral obligation to do this. Yeah, so that's good. All right. Let's see. Here's Andre Maurois, the French writer. He says, almost all great writers have as their motif, their theme, a passage from childhood to maturity, a clash between the thrill of expectation and the disillusioning truth. Lost Illusion is the undisclosed title of every novel. Okay? Here's Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway says, the writer's job is to tell the truth. A big lie is more plausible than the truth. Yeah, we all know that. Okay, now here is Arthur Schopenhauer. He was the great German philosopher. He lived from 1788 to 1860. So the older guy around in Germany before him was Goethe, John von Wolfgang Goethe. And so Goethe was sort of the great genius, kind of like what Shakespeare is to Germany, but even more than that. He's almost like a combination of Shakespeare and Ben Franklin. Okay, he was a scientist as well as a great writer. That's Goethe was. But what I like about Schopenhauer is he's pretty wealthy and inherited money, so he was pretty free to just study all the time. And he taught himself how to read in about 4 or 5 languages. And despite being the best philosopher in Germany, he couldn't get a job at some university as a philosopher, which pissed him off. And he would write and think all morning, and then he'd go to the concerts and shows and theaters and plays in the evening. So he analyzed like pretty much all the known literature at that time, and he tried to come up with why is a piece of literature great versus crappy, okay? And here's what he says. True excellence can be attained only where the work has been produced for its own sake. The truth is that the hobbyist treats his subject as an end, whereas a professional treats it merely as a means. The hobbyist is really in earnest about a matter and has a direct interest because he likes it and he pursues it con amore. It is these hobbyists and not the professionals, the hirelings, who have always done the greatest work. And I think that's a great truth. Because ask yourself, okay, McDougall, he's just an internal medicine doctor. Why is he the best doctor in the world of nutrition? Okay, my primary background, I was a imaging guided surgeon, interventional radiologist, who then became a neuroradiologist. Okay, why is it that I'm so fascinated and I'll tell you the truth about nutrition and I can figure it out, whereas you have all these nutrition PhDs and other researchers and, they're full of crap, talking about keto. What I'm trying to say is when a person does something as a professional because they have to for their job, it's often perceived as a pain in the butt. Like all these textbooks in medicine, they're all wrong. I'm telling you, they all stink. The pathology textbooks, the biochemistry textbooks, the physiology books, they're all wrong and they stink. I wish I had time. I'd rewrite them. I guarantee you that is the truth. And so the reason I tell you this, why is it that all these people, that's their job to be a pathologist and they can't write a pathology book? It's because they're just doing it as a hassle. They get promoted to write research papers, not to write textbooks. And it's a little bit of a pain in the butt to them. A lot of times they turf the textbook job to their fellows, and then the fellows don't know anything. They just copy the old edition. So what you end up with is these books that are 50 to 100 years out of date, and all the important stuff has been left out of the book. And so what I'm trying to say is a professional has to kind of go by the formal thing, and especially young professionals, they're scared to say anything controversial because they're afraid they won't get in trouble, they won't get tenure. So pretty much all their work in the conventional format, and I'm saying like a published textbook format, it almost always stinks versus somebody who really loves the subject, like Richard Moore, MD, PhD, who devoted his life to researching hypertension, potassium, and sodium. He wanted for his legacy to explain to everybody what he discovered over the 50 years of studying that stuff. And it's a beautiful book. It's one of the best medical books ever written, that High Blood Pressure Solution by Richard Moore. It's a masterpiece. Okay, we're going to continue now with Arthur Schopenhauer. He says that the ability to learn a truth is blocked most efficiently by preconceived opinion. The truth has been merely learned. A truth that's merely learned, memorized by a student, for example, is like a false tooth. It adheres to us only because it is put on. But truth that has been acquired by thinking of our own, that really belongs to us. This is the fundamental difference between the thinker and the mere man of learning. The intellectual attainments of a man who thinks for himself, they resemble a fine painting where the light and the shade are correct. The tone is correct and sustained. The color perfectly harmonizes. It is true to life. On the other hand, the intellectual attainments of the mere man of learning, they're like large palettes full of all sorts of colors, which at best are systematically arranged, but they're devoid of any harmony, connection, or meaning. Okay, that's all from Arthur Schopenhauer. One more quote here from Schopenhauer. Simplicity always has been the mark of truth. It is also a mark of genius. The object of science is to recognize the many in the one, to perceive the rules in any given example, and not to go on counting up facts ad infinitum. So yeah, like the genius statements are, the main cause of insulin resistance is high-fat diet, especially saturated fat. Okay, that's super useful. The main causes of hypertension are excess dietary fat and excess dietary sodium and deficiency of dietary potassium and magnesium. Okay, but that's relatively simple. Okay, and it is tremendously useful to know those sorts of simple statements. Okay, Victor Hugo, now we're talking, that was about writing the truth. Now we're talking about how you speak the truth. Victor Hugo, the great French author of Les Miserables and Hunchback of Notre Dame, here he writes, Truth and indignation is the most eloquent speaker. I mean, you've all seen that. Think about somebody in your family who doesn't talk much, isn't the most articulate person, but they got screwed over on something, they're pissed off, and they just articulate what happened. And man, all of a sudden, they're like speaking incredibly accurate and usefully, okay? Oscar Wilde, if you want to tell people the truth, you have to make them laugh or they will kill you. And there's some truth in that too. A lot of people can't handle the truth, and so you have to sugarcoat it in some way, indirect, or, make a outside example or something, or they'll get real pissed off at you. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he's the great Russian author of Gulag Archipelago and a couple other books. He says, anything that adds to the truth subtracts from the truth. And I think that's one of the keys, too, for being a good writer or speaker is get to the point on the stuff that matters. Okay? Anything that adds to the truth subtracts from the truth. And he also says, no one should bar the road to the truth. People need the truth in order to make decisions in their life. Okay? Solzhenitsyn continues, truth, God, and Christianity and Stoicism are good for a person. I would totally agree with that. Being stoic makes you strong. I like the quote by Marcus Aurelius. He says, a man should be like a cliff facing the sea. All day long the waves beat at his ankles, but the cliff is not moved. Yeah, you don't let little things bother you, so you can keep yourself objective and focused on the important things. Okay, here's Patrick Henry, the great speaker of the Founding Fathers from 1775. It is natural for man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and to listen to the song of the siren till she transforms us into beasts. Are we disposed to be of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. Patrick Henry, 1775. He was like the greatest orator of Virginia. Okay, a little bit on absolute versus relative truth. Okay, here's John Ruskin again. All art is the seeking of ideal truth. All art is either instruction or infection. Okay. Music, when healthy, is the teacher of perfect order, and when depraved is the teacher of perfect disorder. And the reason he's so memorable is because hard contrast, instruction or infection, depraved or ennobling. I mean, those are strong contrasts, and they're easy to remember. That's also, I think, why fairy tales are so easy to remember when we read. Good is strongly contrasted with bad, and that sticks out to us. Contrast is memorable. Okay, here's Alan Bloom. He was a guy from the University of Chicago. He wrote the book called The Closing of the American Mind. And here's what he writes. Rock music is junk food for the soul. Okay. And, a lot of rock music is kind of fun, especially when you go in that young phase and you're falling in love, interested in somebody you love, that music. It kind of energizes you for the moment, but a lot of it doesn't have as much of a lasting thing. It's one of the reasons I love Christian music. I'll hear a Christian song that I like 1,000 times. Okay, anyways, Alan Bloom continues. The essence of philosophy is the abandonment of all authority in favor of individual human reason. And by the way, his book, The Closing of the American Mind, is a great book. It really is. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that the truth is relative. Students in this country are being intellectually maimed by the relativism in our classrooms. Because we have rejected moral absolutes, the curriculum has no central reference point to revolve around and no foundation upon which to rest. Yeah, I think that's a disaster. The humanities are much more important than people realize. They'll teach you how to think. They'll teach you how to be articulate, how to write, how to speak well. And we're going to come back to that point, but that's part, I think, of being a well-rounded scholar. And like the greatest scientists and doctors, they have the ability to speak and articulate clearly, and I think that improves what they can do and how they can, teach and do other good things and communicate. Solomon Asch did a lot of research, and one of the things he studied was people's conformity. And what he found was that if you sit a bunch of people at a table, and let's say there's, 10 people, and 9 out of 10 are working with the researchers, and the 10th person's just by themselves, whatever the other 9 people say, most people will agree, even if it's something stupid, 2 plus 2 equals 5, something like that almost. And what he said was the majority of people are very conformist. They'll go against what they know to be the truth, even what they know to be good and right. They'll even be cruel towards other people just to be conformist and fit in with the group. So the sad truth of that is Just like we've got herbivore physiology in our gut for digestion and our metabolism, most people tend to think like a herbivore. The middle of the pack is a safe place to be. And they'll go along with the crowd, just following orders, all that nonsense. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of bad things happening. So if you know somebody who's behaving that way, you can talk to them, help them to sort of snap out of it. But unfortunately, that's all too common in human behavior. Okay, here's Michael Crichton. He was a great author. He wrote books like Jurassic Park and Next and a bunch of other good stuff. The guy was a genius. I liked him. I read like everything his I could get my hands on. So anyways, perceiving the truth has always been a challenge to mankind, but in the disinformation age, it takes on a special urgency. For the most part, members of our species simply repeat what they are told, and they become upset if they are exposed to any different view. The characteristic human trait is conformity. Humans are stubborn, self-destructive conformists. So that's a good point. So just being aware of it, then you're more able to step out of it. Okay, the purpose of life is to stay alive. Watch any animal in nature. All it tries to do is stay alive. Whenever an animal's behavior puts it out of touch with its reality, it becomes extinct. So Michael Crichton. And that's why you need the truth, so you're in touch with reality. Here's Heraclitus, the old Greek philosopher. He says, because it is so unbelievable, the truth often escapes being known. And, a lot of people, they can't think in a complex, nuanced way, but it's important to do that. Musk had an interesting comment. He said almost every rumor he had heard about Twitter, when he came out there, almost every single one of them turned out to be true. That was what he said. Okay. All right, here's Goethe. He said, wisdom is found only in truth. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe that they are free. Okay, so that's a good point. There's a lot of people, they believe absolutely stupid, ridiculous stuff. They've just sort of been trained to think that way, and they have no capacity to think for themselves. And when somebody's locked into that type of thinking, be polite to them, but just avoid them because you can't, they're not capable of reason. Okay, Goethe continues, the truth has been kept from the minds by masters who rule them with lies. They feed them on falsehoods until wrong looks like right in their eyes. Yeah, a lot of people think they're doing something right because they've been brainwashed into it, but they do something cruel and bad. Okay, here's Malcolm Muggeridge. I like him, Malcolm Muggeridge. He's a smart guy, and he went to Russia to visit the place. There were a lot of people in the West who thought Russia was maybe okay. The United States was suffering from the Great Depression with the poor economy, and they thought maybe Russia knows something we don't know. But after he went there and studied the place, he's like, oh my God, it's such a terrible, awful, evil place. And after that, he converted to Christianity and devoted himself to teaching people about all the bad stuff about Russian communism, what an evil disaster it was. Okay. Also, there's some lady recently who defected from North Korea, and she's talking about her experience. You can see her interviewed, a lady from North Korea who I don't remember her name. And she'll tell you what North Korea was like. Oh, it was bad. It's worse than you could believe. Okay, Malcolm Muggeridge, here's what he has to say. It has been said that when human beings stop believing in God, they believe in nothing. But it's worse than that. They believe in anything. Yeah, you can see that just, study current events, and that's pretty obvious. Okay, truth and free speech. This one's from Henri Amiel. Truth is only violated by lies. It may be equally outraged by silence. Philosophy means the complete liberty of the mind. It loves only one thing, truth. Yeah, a lot of times, in a sense, people lie by being silent. They know the truth is different than what's being sort of publicly announced, but they're too scared to talk, or they just know socially it's not in their best interest to talk. And, society's better off if people talk more. Sometimes you got to use your judgment, of course, but it's good that people talk with each other about things that they see going on, help each other. Here we go, Charles Bradlaugh, okay, the Englishman. He says, without free speech, no search for truth is possible. Without free speech, progress is checked, and the nations no longer march forward toward a nobler life. Better a 1,000-fold abuse of free speech than the denial of free speech. I think that's a great quote. Better a 1,000-fold abuse of free speech than a denial of free speech. The abuse dies in a day, but the denial stays for life, the life of the people, and it entombs hope. Yeah, you got to have free speech, or how else can you figure out what's the truth about stuff? And you have to be allowed to say things that are controversial and contradict the official narrative, because otherwise you can't get to the truth on things. A lot of times the initial perspective on a topic is wrong, and you have to be able to work past that if you want to make good decisions. So here's Carl Sagan. He's a guy who, used to talk about the cosmos, and a lot of stuff he said was actually naive and incorrect, but he meant well in terms of his idea about scientific method. Here's what he has to say. A central lesson of science is that to understand complex issues, or even simple ones, we must free our minds of dogma and to guarantee the freedom to publish, to contradict, and to experiment. Arguments from authority are unacceptable. I find that funny, though, because he kind of claimed himself to be an expert and an authority, but nevertheless, it's still well phrased. The suppression of uncomfortable ideas is not the path to knowledge, and there's no place for it in the endeavor of science. We do not know beforehand where insights will arise from. Finding the occasional straw of truth awash in the great ocean of confusion and bamboozle requires intelligence, vigilance, dedication, and courage. So that's Carl Sagan. And he was married to a lady, really feisty, great scientist. What was her name? Lynn Margulis. And she's the one who sort of figured out the symbiotic method of mitochondrial incorporation into other bigger bacteria like archaea and, the development of the eukaryote cell. So anyways, that's a Carl Sagan quote. I got one more from Carl Sagan. We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. This is a clear prescription for disaster. Okay. All right, a little more on truth and free speech. This quote is from J. Robert Oppenheimer. There must be no barriers for freedom of inquiry. There is no place for dogma in science. The scientist is free and must be free to ask any question, to doubt any assertion, to speak for any evidence, to correct any errors. Yeah, people should be allowed to talk freely about nutrition and health and all this stuff and be able to contradict the standard of care ideas because a lot of times they're wrong. Okay, here's a couple quotes from Voltaire. And Voltaire was a genius. He's sort of a pain in the ass in a lot of ways, but he was a genius. I think some of his ideas led to the French Revolution, which I think was a disaster. But on the other hand, he did also do a lot of good things. So here's Voltaire, first quote. I am very fond of the truth, but not at all fond of martyrdom. Voltaire continues, to announce truth is an infallible method of being persecuted. And then Voltaire says, I want my doctor to believe in God so that he does not rob me. Okay. So that's actually kind of a big statement because Voltaire was associated with Diderot and the Philosophes who wrote the great Encyclopedia of France there. And the problem, though, is, these really brilliant philosophers, they can create their own moral code and aesthetic and behave reasonably well. But most regular people can't if they don't have some metaphysic guide taught to them. And Will Durant wrote about this, and he said, basically, if you want people to be moral, you have to teach them religion. If you're going to teach them religion, you have to teach them when they're young. And if they don't have the whole framework, like a heaven and hell context, etc., it's hard for them to understand morality. So that's what we're getting into a sidetrack with that, but that's interesting stuff. Will Durant wrote this really interesting book. It's really the history of France, and the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, centered around Voltaire. I enjoyed it. I went through all the Will Durant history books. I thought they were entertaining and they were good. All right, now here's a quote from Max Wertheimer. He's a Gestalt psychologist. He says, science is rooted in the will to truth. With the will to truth, it stands or falls. Lower the standard even slightly, and science becomes diseased at the core. Not only science, but man. The will to truth, pure and unadulterated, is among the essential conditions of his existence. If the standard is compromised, he easily becomes a kind of tragic caricature of himself. So that's Max Wertheimer. And that's a big statement. The reason, and what that reminds me of course, is look at the research done by pharmacology companies. It stinks, okay? It's a joke. They spent $500 billion researching cancer, and they barely made any improvement since 1970 in 50 years. That's what I'm saying. And then no one's allowed to talk about the benefits of a plant-based diet. That's what happens when you start deviating from truth, okay? And the other thing, medical students are told, oh, you need to study statistics so you'll be able to understand the significance of scientific studies. Yeah, right, BS. You just need to know who funds the study. When something really works in medicine, it's usually obvious. It's not some statistical manipulation. All right, Edwin Percy Whipple, here's what he has to say. Few dare to announce an unwelcome truth. Okay, here's a couple quotes. By the way, I've got all these truth quotes into different categories. I'm going to go through some other famous people on their quotes and a bunch of other contexts. So right here, this page is subjective truth, quotes about that. Blaise Pascal, he was the great mathematician, inventor, and also theologian. He wrote, "Truth is so obscure in these times and falsehood so established that unless we love the truth, we cannot know it." Yeah, it takes effort to know the truth. And he also says, "We know the truth not only by reason, but also by the heart." All right. And here we go with Ralph Waldo Emerson's quote. "The soul is the perceiver and revealer of truth. We know the truth when we see it. Let a skeptic and scoffer say what they choose. Foolish people ask you, when you have spoken what they do not wish to hear, how do you know that is true, and not an error of your own? We know the truth when we see it, from opinion as we know when we are awake that we are awake." Okay, so that's a little bit of a subjective emotional thing to say, but there's obviously some truth in it. I wouldn't call it 100% true. "God offers to every mind its choice between truth and repose. Take which you please, but you can never have both." And so what that means to me is, for example, if you want to be a great scholar in nutrition, pathology, medicine, you're going to have to challenge conventional ideas and conventional publications. And there's going to be people who are making money off that or are just comfortable with it because they've been going by that for decades. So they don't like it when somebody comes along and advances things. So if you're going to challenge the truth, you're going to find yourself in the middle of people not being happy with what you're saying. All right, Michael Crichton. "The rational scientific reductionist method is not the only route to useful truth." All right, and now a little quote from Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish Socrates. Kierkegaard, I love the guy. He's kind of an emotional basket case, but he's a lot of fun and he says a lot of good things. He says, "What I really must get clear is what I am to do, not what I must know, except insofar as knowledge must precede every act. What matters is to find a purpose, to see what it really is that God wants me to do. The crucial thing is to find a truth that is true for me, to find the idea for which I am willing to live and die. That is what my soul thirsts for, as the desert thirsts for water. While objective truths are known and can be verified by consensus, subjective truths are lived and experienced and can be true for us based on our experience alone. Subjective truths are more important." Soren Kierkegaard. Okay, here's Alfred Adler. He's one of the guys who came out of the psychoanalysis school of Freud. So Carl Jung and Alfred Adler were the two great proteges of Freud, and then they kind of broke away from Freud. So here's Alfred Adler. "Every therapeutic cure, any attempt to show the patient the truth, tears him from his freedom from responsibility, and therefore must reckon with the most vehement resistance." Okay, so yeah, a lot of people get pissed off when you tell them they have to change their behavior. They don't want to hear it. Okay, Adler continues, "A lie would have no sense unless the truth were felt as dangerous." All right, here's Carl Rogers, another psychologist. He says, "The only kind of learning which significantly influences behavior is self-discovered or self-appropriated learning, truth which has been assimilated in experience." Yeah, you can't just, if you just tell a person something, a lot of times they don't even hear it or they ignore it or they don't understand it and they don't grasp it in a visceral, emotional way. So it's more like if you explain something, then they have a eureka moment and they get it, then they incorporate it into their own thinking. Okay, Lao Tzu, "People would rather believe a simple lie than a complex truth." Yeah, a lot of times people, they don't want to go into the nuance, but sometimes you have to understand something. Okay, Truth in Medicine. And here's a quote by Kelly Brogan. She's a real famous psychiatrist. She's an Irish-Italian lady, real feisty. She's real pretty. It's a little bit crazy. She's the one at her website. She had herself pole dancing. I thought, oh my God, this beautiful lady psychiatrist pole dancing. I thought that was funny. But she's actually very smart. She went to MIT. Okay, she actually trained with that guy Nick Gonzalez, which is kind of a clever, strange guy with all his autonomic nervous system publications. But I thought he was pretty interesting. So anyways, here's Kelly Brogan talking. the psychiatrist. Before I stopped prescribing, I never cured a single patient, not one. Now I cure people every week in my practice. Depression is not a disease. Depression is a symptom. She herself fell into a vortex of endless prescription medication. I think she got sick postpartum for a while. She says the system creates patients, people who are otherwise healthy, and they just need to recalibrate their bodies using some simple lifestyle interventions, which mostly, focus around diet. This idea that medications create a neurotransmitter imbalance is so universally accepted that no one bothers to question it or even to research it. 6 decades of study have never shown a link between a low serotonin or norepinephrine level and depression. The serotonin theory of depression is a myth. We really have no idea what's going on. That's an amazing thing for a doctor to admit. We really have no idea what's going on. We can't measure serotonin in a living brain yet. We like to cling to simple explanations. The truth is that we have very little idea about what these medications are actually doing. There is no free lunch with medication treatment. Medications lead to a whack-a-mole game of new problems. Yeah, you treat the medicine, the new side effect pops up, and then you treat that with a new medicine. So anyway, she wrote a pretty good book about psychiatry and stuff. She's written a couple of them. Okay, the quest for the truth. Some thoughts on what's involved in getting yourself pumped up, energized, and able to find truth. Elias Canetti, he wrote an interesting book. I forget the name of it. I got a copy of it on my shelf here, but it was very interesting about his observations about human behavior. You draw closer to the truth by shutting yourself out from mankind. Time in the wilderness. Okay, Francis Bacon. On the wrong path, a genius just gets farther and farther away from the truth. He just gets there more quickly. But even a plotter on the right path moves us ever closer towards the truth about God's world. Okay, and now here's Ayn Rand. The truth is only for those who seek it. His truth was his only motive. He held his truth above all things. His vision, his strength, his courage came from his own spirit. It is the secret of their creative power, that it was self-sufficient, self-motivated, self-generated. He had lived for himself. And only by living for himself was he able to achieve things which are the glory of mankind. Such is the nature of achievement. Okay, so anyways, Ayn Rand said that her entire focus as a writer was to show mankind the ideal of what they could be. So to put forth the idea of the great inventor, innovator, and whatnot, and that came out of her own childhood. She was born in Russia, and the whole takeover there by the Bolsheviks, destroyed her father's business. And people are all starving and dying. And then she comes to the United States and she sees the skyscrapers in the big cities. And she's like, oh my God, this is the best country ever existed in the history of the world. Okay, next, Julien Lemaitre. He says, for a wise man it is not enough to study nature and truth. He must proclaim it for the few who are able to think. The rest can't reach the truth any more than frogs can fly. It definitely helps a person to have other persons to talk to. They can think better. They can work through problems a lot better. Whenever I get an idea and I'm trying to work on it, I love to have someone to talk to about it. Okay, Victor Davis Hanson. He wrote a book called Who Killed Homer? And he says, truth only emerges through dissent and open criticism. This guy actually did a lot of good things. He's not the most exciting guy in the world, but he's good. I've read a couple of his books and they were good. Let's see, miscellaneous truths. All right, let's go. Herbert Agar. He says the truth which makes men free is for the most part the truth which they don't want to hear. Robert Pierce. He's the guy who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a great book. It says the truth knocks on the door and you say, "Go away, I'm looking for the truth." So the truth goes away, puzzling. Okay, William Birnbach. He says the truth is not the truth until people believe you. Yeah, I've had that experience. It's hard to get people to believe you. People will believe an authority figure, sort of a well-known so-called expert, even when they're obviously full of crap. And then if someone who's not known tells them something, they just won't believe it. But anyways, he says, and they won't listen unless you're interesting, imaginative, and fresh. You got to say the right thing in such a way that people feel it in their gut, because if they don't feel it in their gut, in an emotional way, nothing will happen. And I would basically say what I see on the internet is if somebody's promoting profitable food, coffee, tea, or some other nonsense, they'll get tons of views and they'll be promoted, versus somebody who's telling people boring stuff, be a low-fat vegan. No one, it doesn't get promoted at all. So what actually works is boring. There's no glamour. There's no money in it. Okay, Balthasar Gracian, he says, the truth is generally seen and rarely heard. Yeah, a lot of times you'll see and you'll viscerally know what the real deal is, but no one's going to talk about it. Okay, Arnold Toynbee, The Great History, he said, mythology is an intuitive form of apprehending and expressing universal truth. Yeah, it's one thing. You want to spend some time, spend time, look at the Greek plays. They're amazingly good. Yeah, like read Antigone, okay? Read Oedipus Rex, or just, the storybooks or commentary on them. It's all great. Amazing how much great stuff came out of Athens in the early 400s there. Okay, Alfred North Whitehead. It is rigid dogma that destroys the truth. Yeah, watch out for that. The other thing I've noticed too is what I've seen through my years at all the different university fancy places I've been is that a lot of times the phonies are real polite and professional, and they never say anything interesting. They never do anything interesting. And the really bright ones, they're more sort of quirky, and they're more likely to say something that pisses other people off or other people think is rude, but that's just how it is because they're talking freely and openly. They're thinking out loud, versus the bullshit artists, they sort of hide behind mainstream mentality. Okay, Bertrand Russell, here's a quote by him. The resistance to a new idea is increased by the square of its importance. Yeah, so nobody's going to give you too much grief if you criticize aspirin because there's no money. There's not much money in an aspirin, okay? But if you criticize some profitable thing, chemotherapy, open heart surgery, they don't like that, okay? Okay, love of truth. The truth is always exciting. This is Pearl Buck, the writer. I think she lives in China for a while. Truth is always exciting. Speak it. Life is dull without it. Yeah, you know how you got some relative who spouts out loud the truth, and even though they might be a little vulgar and rude, they're a lot of fun to have around. Albert Camus, always go too far, because that is where you will find the truth. Cicero, our minds have an insatiable desire to know the truth. And Aristotle said basically the same thing. And you feel it inside yourself. When something's important to you, you want the truth. When you're uncertain about something important, you want that resolved. Okay, here's Goethe. In order to learn a complex topic, a man must love it. Yeah, that's how you get through the tedium. And the other one was by, like Tim Ferriss had a good learning curve. You first start going up, and that's your excitement phase with a new topic, and you're dreaming about what you could do with that subject material and knowledge. Then you go through this long, tedious plateau phase of learning all the nuts and bolts and details. But then once you kind of mastered it, then you can start doing original research and creative thought, and then it becomes a lot of fun again. But yeah, you got to love it enough to get through that plateau. Most people never get through that plateau, and they don't learn the subject well, but that's what you got to do to learn the subject well. Okay, truth in education. Here's Jose Ortega Gasset. The man who discovers a new scientific truth has previously had to smash almost everything he had learnt, and arrives at the new truth with hands bloodstained from the slaughter of 1,000 platitudes. So what that means is, I've seen this in medicine, is when you figure out a new way to look at something, you have to figure out how to refute all the old stuff. And a lot of people, they really don't like that. Like, when you explain to people, cholesterol, yeah, it matters, but it's not what atherosclerosis is really all about. It's a highly relevant component, but atherosclerosis is a blood clot. People freak out when they hear that. I never met a doctor in my life that actually knows that until I've explained it to them. And the guy who taught me that was when I started reading Gregory Sloop's book on hematology and hemorrheology. Okay, and then I confirmed it, all my observations. It matched what I saw on all the CAT scans. Okay, Jose Ortega Gasset continues, the most radical division that it is possible to make of humanity is that which splits into two classes of creatures. Those who make great demands upon themselves, piling up difficulties and duties, and those who demand nothing special of themselves, but for whom to live is to be every moment what they already are, without imposing on themselves any effort towards perfection. They're like mere buoys that float on the waves. So yeah, what he's basically saying is the biggest, in his opinion, difference between people is some of them push themselves to be the best they can be, but a lot of people, they just settle for, sort of who they are and what they are 10 years ago, and they never try to improve. Okay, Jose Ortega Gasset continues, the average man studies in school because he is forced to, not because he wants to learn, and he does not learn. And so the enormous gap continues to grow between the genuine cultural knowledge of mankind and that of the average man. The root structural heritage of modern scientists and culture is not learned by the average man. And so, underneath the superficial veneer of modernity, the average man remains an uncultured barbarian, prone to violence, and this has led to humanity's return to barbarism. Okay, that's coming from Jose Ortega y Gasset, and his essay is on studying some lessons in metaphysics. And then he continues, the mass of people crushes beneath it everything that is different, everything that is excellent, everything of the individual, qualified and select. I never like crowds. Like you go to a concert, it's so loud it makes you deaf, and there's all these people falling all over the place. Defending the truth. Ralph Waldo Emerson here. Talent working with joy in the cause of a universal truth lifts the possessor to a new power. Yeah, if you're enthusiastic about something, you'll learn it faster, better. Wherever the truth is injured, defend it. Yeah, people should do that. Wherever the truth is injured, defend it. When somebody tries to tell you modern art is good, you should tell them, a child could do that. That's a bunch of crap. Because if you allow yourself to continually be chumped, you end up not being able to think very well. Okay, Ralph Waldo Emerson continues, no man fully understands the truth until he has contended against it. The finest and noblest ground on which people can live is the truth. Yeah, think about it. The people you like, you're honest with each other. Okay, that's the way to be. Montaigne, I speak the truth, not my fill of it, but as much as I dare speak. And I dare do so a little more as I grow old. Yeah, that's another thing I like about old people. A lot of old people, they'll tell you the truth about stuff. That's why I like those old writers when they're writing those books in their retirement phase. They tell you the truth. Versus, like I said, a lot of young professors are all scared. Scared of tenure, scared of getting in trouble. And so they're wimpy. Plus, they don't have enough experience yet, the young ones. Okay, Charles Péguy, however you say his name, he says, he who does not bellow the truth when he knows the truth makes himself an accomplice of liars. Tyranny is always better organized than freedom. Yeah, that's another sadly true thing. The honest man must be a perpetual rebel, for the man who wishes to remain faithful to the truth must perpetually reject convention. Yeah, and that's truth. That's what happens in medicine. Like I said, when you're an athlete in sport and you innovate and create a new, better way, everybody likes it. But in academics, man, you show a better way, and then people are jealous, people are pissed off, you might interfere with their profits, you might interfere with their turf. They don't like it because you have to challenge convention if you're going to make new scientific and medical discoveries. Socrates, to not be deceived, one must know accurately the similarity and dissimilarity of things. He also says, for us to live a good life, we have to know what is good and we have to avoid what is bad. Okay, here's a quote from Plato. Those who are able to see beyond the shadows and the lies of their culture, the cave, will never be understood, yet alone believed by the masses. No man is more hated than he who speaks the truth. Yep, unfortunately. Okay, a little bit on the nature of the truth. The scientist knows very well that he is approaching ultimate truth only in an asymptotic curve, meaning that you get close to it, but you never fully get 100% to the truth. And he is barred from ever reaching it completely. But at the same time, he is proudly aware of being indeed able to determine whether a statement is nearer or less near to approaching the truth. That's from Conrad Lorenz. He did all that stuff about imprinting with animals. Okay, this is sort of, people telling the truth are more likely to say I. They'll put themselves into it. When they're lying, they're more likely to distance themselves from it, be anonymous from it. Okay, that's anonymous. Okay, here's Thomas Macaulay. The doctrine of all sects is simply this. I am right and you are wrong. When you are stronger, you ought to tolerate me, for it is your duty to tolerate the truth. But when I am stronger, I shall persecute you, for it is my duty to persecute error. So he's talking about how a lot of groups can be unfair. He's certainly seen that historically, like the way the British treated the Irish. Sir Walter Scott, without courage, there cannot be truth. George Bernard Shaw, all great truths begin as blasphemies. Okay, now, first a quote by H.L. Mencken. He was sort of the American writer-scholar, and then John Stuart Mill. Okay, so H.L. Mencken says, most people want security in this world, not liberty. The whole world has little liking for the habitual truth-teller and truth-seeker. He is always unpopular, and not infrequently his unpopularity is so excessive that it endangers his life. Run your eye back over the list of martyrs, lay and clerical. 9/10 of them you will find stood accused of nothing worse than an honest effort to find out and announce the truth. H.L. Mencken. Kind of scary there. Okay, John Stuart Mill. He who only knows his side of the case knows little of that. The most incessant occupation of the human intellect throughout life is the ascertainment of truth. The test of real and vigorous thinking, the thinking which ascertains truth instead of dreaming dreams, is successful application to practice. Everything must be free to be written and published without restraint. It is only through a clash of adverse opinions that the remainder of the truth has any chance of being supplied. The only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every point of view, of every variety of opinion, and studying all modes in which it can be looked upon by every character of mind. All ideas need to be heard, because each idea contains within it one aspect of the truth. By examining that aspect, we add to our own idea of the truth. And even ideas that have no truth in them whatsoever can still be useful, because by disproving them, we add support to our own ideas. Let's see. Okay, so here we go. John Stuart Mill continues. Every man who says frankly and fully what he thinks is doing a public service, and we should be grateful to him for challenging our most cherished opinions. John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill was a brilliant guy. His father taught him how to speak Greek by the time he was like 5 years old, and he was a bright Englishman. And so what I like about him, he did write some excellent stuff on liberty and thinking and truth. What I don't like about him was he wanted truth for the Englishmen, the English aristocrats. He didn't want truth for the people of Ireland or the people of India. But anyways, he did write some good stuff on liberty. Okay, here's some words from Nietzsche. So he's the great German philosopher. Truth serves life. All great intellects are skeptical. A mind that aspires to great things is necessarily skeptical. Fully mature intellects love truth. We already did that one. All things are subject to interpretation. Which interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not of truth, not necessarily of truth. Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. Young people love what is interesting and odd, no matter how true or false it is. More mature minds, they love what is interesting and odd about the truth. A fully mature intellect will finally love the truth, even when it is plain and simple, boring to the ordinary person, for they have noticed that truth tends to reveal itself in the highest wisdom in the guise of simplicity. Nietzsche continues, the surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him in higher esteem than those who think alike, that those who think alike are better than those who think differently. Yeah, that's what always is taught to kids in high school, to be conformists, and it makes them kind of intellectually weaker. By the way, I have a debate where I sort of put a bunch of quotes from Nietzsche and contrasting quotes from Dostoevsky. So that if you ever want to see that video, it's a debate between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. A lot of people told me they really liked that one, and I found both of them fascinating. Okay, a little more Jose Ortega Gasset on truth and education. And I know I had a couple quotes by him just a moment ago. This is, I think, different stuff. So here's what he writes. It is enough to compare the approach of a man who is going to study an already existing science with the approach of a man who feels a real and sincere and genuine need for it. The one who feels a need, who feels like they're just being forced to study it, like a typical student, pre-med student, medical student, they will not tend to question the content of the science or to criticize it. On the contrary, the person who needs to know the answer, he will comfort himself by thinking that the contents of the science that already exists he's going to challenge it. What he seeks is simply to assimilate it as already is. The big point of this quote here is that the typical student just wants to pass a test, get their grade, move on with their career. But somebody who really wants to understand science, they're going to look at it backwards and forwards and upside down because they have to know. Let's say someone in your family is sick and you want to help them get better. You have to know the truth. So you really care about every little detail and nuance. What is true? What's going to work? How can you save them? How can you save yourself? Okay. So I thought that was great. And so what Jose Ortega Gasset is really saying here is that most academics and student classes are a falsification. They're stupefying. Basically, the students memorize stuff for a test, but they don't really learn anything. And yeah, I actually think, the Oxford tutor method is so much better, where they have conversations with their professor. They read extensively on a subject and they come back and they discuss it with their professor. But it's too expensive to provide education that way. What tends to be the educational format is these big lecture halls, because that's very profitable for universities and high schools to some extent. And then students just take a Scantron test, and it's like a horse race. The fastest horses advance to the next level. But they're not really learning much. And that's why you can talk to a fourth-year medical student and you can ask them questions about all the common diseases and they won't know a single thing. And I always joke when I have a medical student, I say to them, I can teach you more in 1 hour than you've learned in the last 4 years. And they always laugh at first, and then afterwards they give me this embarrassed look that they know I just told them the truth. Okay, let's see. Continuing on with Gasset. Okay, here it is. Here's a quote I like. Estar is to be studying biology. Ser is to see yourself as a biologist. Yeah, so Estar is to be taking biology class to take a test. Ser is to want to become a biologist. And if you want to become a biologist, a member of that club, you'll learn it so much faster. When I started hanging around with a guy, Jay Ream, who was getting an A+ in biology, just by hanging around with him, I all of a sudden got so much better at everything in science because I saw it through his eyes. He wanted to be a biologist. He became a biologist. He's a great biologist. Okay, every living creature is happy when he fulfills his destiny, like when he realizes himself that when he's being what in truth he is. That's kind of like James Watson quote, an animal's happy when it does what it's designed to do, like a horse is happy when it runs. So if you see yourself as being something and you carry out that activity, it makes you happy. Okay, Bertrand Russell's a couple words on truth. Bertrand Russell was a brilliant guy. He's a little bit of a bullshitter, but he does write some good things. I think Ayn Rand called him sort of a modern David Hume, which she meant as a little bit of being a bullshitter. Ayn Rand, she loved Aristotle. Aristotle was the best, okay? And I agree with that too. Okay, anyways, Bertrand Russell on truth. An inner voice speaks with absolute authority that no vain words can diminish, bidding us to follow truth though he slay us, though he blast the lives that we love, though he wither the flowers of joy and dry up with his parched breath the pleasant springs of happiness. In his service is courage. In his service only can the soul grow great. In his service only, that of truth, the shining lights are kindled on the mountaintop, by which far off in the plain humanity is guided in the night of fear and perplexity. Alone the priest of truth lives in the service of the generations to come, and keeps ever bright the sacred flame. Pity he may feel for those who dwell below, but fellowship only in the mystic communion of those who create and tend the lights which illumine the world. Okay, so basically Bertrand Russell just wrote a fancy poem about saying why he thinks philosophers and scientists and scholars, he likes them, okay? And I've noticed every field thinks its own field is the best one. That's partly why they went into it, but so the philosophers like Aristotle, Bertrand Russell, they think philosophers are the best men. But the funny thing is, look at the poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. He said that countries should be ruled by poets because poets are the best. So every group always thinks it's the best. Like in medicine, there's a story that each field thinks its own field is the best one. Like let's say for treating cancer, the oncologist thinks they're the best, the radiation oncologist thinks they're best, the surgeon thinks they're the best. Okay, here's Charles Murray on truth, studying great achievements. He said, a totalitarian state effectively quashes human accomplishment in the arts and philosophy. They are only slightly less stifling in the sciences, and that is because they at least allow some enclaves of freedom and learning in the intellectual institutions where they want something done. These judgments are based on the Soviet, Chinese, Communist, and Eastern European records through the 20th century. The inventories are of only limited use because they typically end at 1950, when even those as young as 50 already had grown up for at least the first 18 years of their life in a non-communist government. It is worth noting that as of 1950, the Soviet Union had produced no significant figures in the visual arts who had not made their reputation before 1917. I think that's funny. So basically, if you look at the history of Russian literature and art, they had a lot of great writers in the 1800s. Look at Dostoevsky, Gogol, Pushkin, Tolstoy, okay, and then they stink in the 1900s. The only people who were worth a crap are the ones who criticize them, and that would be Boris Pasternak with Dr. Zhivago and Solzhenitsyn with Gulag Archipelago. Okay, and then they stunk. There's not. I'm not even aware of a single good painting from the 1900s. After 1918 by a Russian. Okay, whereas they had a lot of really nice painting, like Ivashevsky, the Ninth Wave in 1800s. Okay. All right, so Murray continues. One of the most overlooked aspects of excellence is how much work it takes. Fame can easily come overnight, but excellence is almost always accompanied by a crushing workload pursued with a single-minded intensity. Strenuous effort over long periods of time is a repetitive theme in the biographies of the giants, sometimes taking on mythical proportions like Michelangelo when he painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Even the most famous supposed exceptions, like Mozart, actually illustrate the rule. Mozart was one of the lighter spirits among the giants, but his reputation for composing effortlessly was overstated. Mozart himself complained on more than one occasion that it wasn't as easy as it looked, and his devotion to work was as single-minded as Beethoven, who struggled with his composition more visibly. I remember Mozart, I read through all his quotes and stuff. He said, "I have studied all the great composers numerous times." He's a hardworking guy. Consider the summer of 1788. Mozart was living in a city that had experienced bread riots that summer, and in a country that was mobilizing for war. Mozart was financially desperate. He was forced to pawn his belongings and to move to a cheaper apartment. He tried even to sell the pawnbroker's tickets to get more loans. But most tickets to the pawnbroker to get more loans. But most devastating of all, his beloved 6-month-old daughter had died in June. And yet, in June, when his daughter was dying, and in July and August, he completed 2 piano trios, a piano sonata, a violin sonata, and 3 symphonies, 2 of them among his most famous. This could not have been done except by someone who, as Mozart himself once put it, was immersed in music, soaked in music, all day long. Yeah, I love the movie Amadeus. It's one of the greatest movies of all time about the life of Mozart. Okay, Charles Murray continues. The willingness to engage in such monomaniacal levels of effort in the sciences and creative arts is related to a sense of vocation. By vocation, I have in mind the dictionary definition of a function or station in life to which one is called by God. However, I hedge at the necessity of God as the source. Many scientists see themselves as having a vocation in the service of truth. I'd agree with that. I think a lot of the best in all kinds of areas has been service to God, but other ones will say it was in the service of truth, and however that means to them. Many other achievers see themselves as having a vocation without thinking about where it came from. My point is that a person with a strong sense of this is what I was born to do, this is what I was put on earth to do, is more likely to accomplish great things than someone who doesn't have that. Nihilists are also at a disadvantage when it comes to their choice of content. Once again, I am talking about means and distributions for which there are individual exceptions. But even looking at those exceptions, coming at the beginning of a nihilistic period, you will see, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche, he wrote about the great theme of philosophy, as did Jean-Paul Sartre. They too had been struggling to bring down an edifice of the old Western way in Christianity. Okay? What they thought was wrong. Whether in philosophy, literature, art, or music, the choice of content becomes more problematic. If life is purposeless, then no one kind of project is intrinsically more important than another. Without a sense of purpose, the creative personality has no template, and that will force a reassessment. So what he's basically saying is if you don't have a religious framework, or you're criticizing a religious framework, it's hard for you to do much. All right, so anyways, and like he also said in other things, how can you criticize somebody like Bach, Newton, Michelangelo, okay? They did the most, okay, and they're the most religious. All right, now manipulation of the truth. So understanding the truth is a good thing, and then seeing how it's manipulated. Information flooding. What I've seen information flooding is, for example, if you go to a bookstore and look at the diet shelf, you'll see there's like about 99 nonsense books, keto, low carb, carnivore, all this nonsense for every low-fat vegan book, all right? I call that information flooding, ruling by fooling. Now, here's a quote by Lewis Carroll. He's the guy who wrote Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland. He says, if you want to inspire confidence, give plenty of statistics. It does not matter that they should be accurate or even intelligible as long as there is enough of them. Yeah, you read all the scientific journals. There'll be endless statistics and BS, but there's very little useful stuff in there. Okay, in the medical journals. All right, this one is from G.K. Chesterton. He wrote, "The purpose of the newspaper is to suppress the news. At present, it's not the people who silence the press. It's the press that silences the people. If you never believe the press, and if you always believe private gossip, within reason, you will probably be right. The newspapers exist for the purpose of preventing the truth from being told. It is practically impossible to get the truth out of a newspaper, even the so-called honest newspapers. It is a conspiracy of a very few millionaires, all sufficiently agreed upon as to what a great nation should know about itself. Bad journalism ruins the nation. It acts on the corporate national will and sways the common national decision. People will believe anything passed by an editor who they have never seen, employing a reporter they have never seen, printed in an office they've never visited, for reasons they will never know." That's right, yeah, most people, they'll believe stuff. I remember I was talking to this one lady. She had junior college education. This is probably about 15 years ago. And she said to me, "Well, it's in the newspaper. It has to be true." I said, "Well, it's in the newspaper, therefore it has to be wrong." I can tell you, when it comes to nutrition, for example, the newspapers, they're always wrong, 100% of the time. Or at least 99.999% of the time. Okay, William Godwin, he says, "If he who employs coercion against me could mold me to his purposes by argument, there's no doubt that he would. He pretends to punish me because his arguments are strong, but in reality, he's punishing me because his argument is weak." Yeah, that's very true. When people are forced to do stuff, if it was good reason, people would do it voluntarily. Okay, Malcolm Muggeridge, he says, he went to Russia in 1932 as a pro-communist, and then he saw and learned the truth, and he came out there rejecting communism. Okay, we talked about him already. Here's a Malcolm Muggeridge quote: "Only a dead fish swims with the stream." Yeah, it's easy to be a conformist. It's hard to be an individualist and to really think. Malcolm Muggeridge continues, "Education is the great mumbo-jumbo fraud of the age. It purports to equip us to live, yet it is prescribed as a universal remedy for everything, from juvenile delinquency to premature senility. But for the most part, it simply enlarges stupidity. It enhances credulity and puts those subjected to it at the mercy of brainwashers with their printing presses, radio, and television at their disposal." Yeah, so most of the information, sort of mainstream information, it's wrong. It's not true. It's designed to make people into chumps, because everybody can make money off a chump. People don't make money off it easy if you're a smart, healthy, low-fat vegan. All right, manipulation of truth, page 2 on this topic. The trouble, and this is Hannah Arendt. So she really studied communism. She studied a lot of the totalitarian countries of the 1900s, and then she wrote a sort of a big book about it. And here's what she said about Eichmann. The trouble was that there were so many like him, and that many of them were neither perverted or sadistic. They were, and still are, terribly normal. And from her viewpoint and that of others, the moral standards and judgment, this normality was much, much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together. Because what this means is average people will do very bad things if they're brainwashed into doing bad things. And so what it means is it's not like you're dealing with one sadistic, crazy, bad person. No, you're dealing with average people simply brainwashed to behave badly. And the point is that could happen in any country. And we've already seen examples of that happening in the United States. Hopefully that won't get worse, but unfortunately it could. So hopefully it won't. Okay, here's a guy named Slavik Zizek. Hard to pronounce his name. The horror of communism and Stalinism is not that bad people do bad things. It's that good people do horrible things. And they sometimes think they're doing something great. I've seen that too. I've seen people doing absolutely terrible things to other people. But in their own simple minds, they believe they're doing something good. A good rule of thumb is if the person doesn't want you doing it to them, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. Okay, Hannah Arendt continues, "Before a mass leader can seize power and fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by extreme contempt for the facts. For in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of the man who can make it, can fabricate it." Hannah Arendt continues, "The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. There is a strange interdependence between thoughtlessness and evil. One of the great advantages of evil was to turn any statement into a question of motive." Yeah, you'll see that in a pattern if you're having a conversation with somebody, they don't like what you say. Instead of debating what you say, they'll try to say, "Oh, well, why do you say that? You say that because of such and such a reason." So they can't win on the facts, so they then try to, go after the person. Unfortunately, Hannah Arendt continues, The most striking difference between ancient and modern sophistry is that the ancients were satisfied with a passing victory of argument at the expense of truth, whereas the modern sophists, totalitarians, they want a more lasting victory at the expense of reality. Yeah, you look at the internet and you see all kinds of things. You're getting sort of flooded with stuff that's not true. I call that gaslighting, trying to make you think you're crazy or that something not true is true. Okay, the person who was the discoverer of the role of forgiveness in human affairs was Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, she continues on. The aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions, but to destroy the capacity to form any. That's what that relativistic thinking is. It ruins a person's ability to think. It's almost like Immanuel Kant saying you can't trust your own mind. It's all BS. Okay, she continues, men can only make sense of experience to the extent they can talk about it. Yeah, that's why people need to talk. The more people talk to each other, the more they work towards the truth of something. So that's another sign, too, of a tyranny. It doesn't want people talking to each other. It wants everybody broken apart, divide and conquer. You know, it wants families broken apart and divorced. It wants people not talking to each other. So people need to talk to each other, and then they work together to find the truth, figure out the truth. Hannah Arendt continues, power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. Power is never the property of an individual. It belongs to a group, and it remains in existence only so long as the group keeps together. So she's pretty interesting. Okay, manipulation of the truth, page 3. I think this will be the last page on this, maybe one more. In times of universal deceit, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act. The further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those who speak it. That's all coming from George Orwell, author of 1984. He was a brilliant guy. You study him and his I've read a couple biographies about him. He is really good. He was a brilliant guy, and his life totally led to him to his writing. If all records told the same tale, then the lie had passed into history and become the truth. He who controls the past, was the party slogan, controls the future. And he who controls the present controls the past. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Yeah, that's kind of scary. So that's why you don't want people rewriting the past. You want to know the past, the truth about it. Okay, Gustave Le Bon, he was a great advertising guy, and he wrote, an error crowned with prestige will be more powerful than the truth without prestige. The masses have never thirsted after truth. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master, and whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. So yeah, I like that. An error crowned with prestige. So if some person with a prestigious title and a lot of money behind them gets up and says something, it could be the exact opposite of the truth. People believe it. And then if somebody else tells them, somebody who's not funded by money or has an authoritative title, no matter how true and obvious it is, they'll often not believe it. That's just how human nature is. Okay, George Lichtenberg says, soothsayers make a better living in the world than truthsayers. Yeah, there's not a lot of money in the truth, but it's good to have it. Okay, here's Polybius, one of the Romans. He says, the best education for actual life is the study of history. But if history is deprived of truth, then we are left with nothing but an idle tale. Okay, George Orwell now quotes again, one has only to think of the sinister possibilities of the radio, controlled education, and so forth, to realize that the truth is great and the truth will prevail is a prayer rather than an axiom. Okay, here's Oswald Spengler. He wrote, the press today is an army with carefully organized arms and branches, with journalists as officers and readers as soldiers. But here, as in every army, the soldier obeys blindly, and aims and operations and plans change without his knowledge. The reader neither knows nor is allowed to know the purposes for which he is used, nor even the role that he is to play. A more appalling caricature of freedom or thought could not be imagined. Formerly, a man did not dare to think freely. Now he dares, but he cannot. His will to think is only a willingness to think to order. And this is what he feels is his liberty. Yeah, that's true. The average chump, and I got family relatives who are like that. They don't have any original thoughts. Whatever's the latest trend, they just believe it. And there's really kind of no point in talking to them. I'm always polite to them, but I think they're idiots. Okay, Spengler continues, what is truth? For the multitude, that which it continually reads and hears. Whatever the press wills, they take it as true. 3 weeks of press work, and the truth is acknowledged by everybody. Bunch of chumps. Okay, Thomas Sowell. There are only two ways of telling the complete truth, anonymously and posthumously. Thomas Shaz, a great psychiatrist, he says, speaking the truth is a luxury that few people can afford. Samuel Johnson, if nothing may be published but what the authorities shall have previously approved, then power will always be the standard of truth. And that's kind of like what Dostoevsky said. The standard of truth tends to be power. That's why it's good to spend time on your own reading to get past it. Okay, here's the last page on manipulation of truth. Okay, John Swinton, he wrote, these several quotes are all by John Swinton. The business of a journalist is to destroy the truth, to lie outright, to pervert, and this came from back in 1915. Imagine how much worse it is now. To lie outright, to pervert, to vilify, to fawn at the feet of Mammon, of money, and to sell his race and his country. Okay, there is no such thing in America as an independent press, unless it is in the country towns. You know it, and I know it. I am paid $150 a week for keeping my honest opinions out of the paper that I am connected with. Others of you are paid similar salaries for similar things. And any of you who would be so foolish as to write his honest opinion would be out on the streets looking for another job. We are the tools and vassals of the rich men behind the scenes. We are the jumping jacks. They pull the strings and we dance. Our talents, our possibilities, and our lives are just the property of other men. We are intellectual prostitutes. There is not a one of you who would dare to write his honest opinions. And if you did, you know very well beforehand it would never appear in print. So anyways, that was said by John Swinton, newspaper guy back in 1915, and it is so much worse nowadays. Okay, here's a quote by Edward Dabby. Edward Abbey, he says, truth is always the enemy of power, and power is always the enemy of truth. The power system always wants the people to be wrong, to be ignorant, because then they're easier to control. They're easier to rip them off and get their money from them. A leader leads from the front by example. A ruler pushes from behind with a whip. Without courage, all other virtues are useless. Okay, let's see. Taxation is how the sheep are shorn. Okay, and then he also says, the man who is angered by nothing cares about nothing. There's some truth in that. The industrial way of life leads to industrial way of death. From Shiloh to Dachau to Stalin to Hiroshima, the great focus of technology has been the mass production of human corpses. And there's actually some sad truth in that. What I mean by that is, if you want to learn what makes a person healthy, it's been around since Adam and Eve. Friendship, love, caring for each other, helping each other, sunshine, eating plant foods. All this modern science, it hasn't really improved health that much. Okay, truth in biology. This comes from Ann Coulter, her book Godless. She's a brilliant writer, and she's funny too. You know, here's this lady, she's not her field at all, and she read all about evolutionary biology, and then she wrote a really funny book about it. Far from showing a gradual change, with one species slowly giving way to another, as Darwin hypothesized, the fossil record shows vast numbers of new species suddenly appearing out of nowhere, and they remain largely unchanged for millions of years, and then disappearing. Almost like there was a big flood or something. Anyways, that was funny. All right, Dante. The truth justifies itself. You don't need advertising money to prove that 2 + 2 = 4. But lies, they justify themselves by violence. Yeah, that's true. When something is wrong, you have to force people to accept it. Okay, the truth helps people to overcome lies. There's Dante. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Nothing in the world is harder than speaking the truth, and nothing is easier than flattery. Yeah, it takes guts and your fear of not being liked or being pushed out of something if you tell the truth. Okay, Albert Einstein. Blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of truth. Okay, this is the last slide, religious truth. This is coming from Paul Johnson. He's the English historian. He's actually an English Catholic. All right, so I think he actually died recently, but he was a decent historian. I don't think he's the best historian or the best writer, but he's still decent. Okay, Paul Johnson. If we allow atheism to cut our umbilical cord from God, our source of ethical vitality would be gone. Morally, we would become nothing more than clever monkeys. Our ultimate fate would be too horrible to contemplate. For the truth is that we humans are like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde creatures, and the monster within us is always striving to take over. Man owes his humanity to the notion of God. And if this notion disappears from his thoughts and his vocabulary, the humanity would disappear too. Man without God is a doomed creature. The history of the 20th century proves the view that as the vision of God fades, we first become mere clever monkeys, and then we exterminate each other. That's coming from Paul Johnson, historian, 1928. He was born in 1928. I think he just died recently. Okay, here's G.K. Chesterton again. The apostles might have hidden the body of Jesus in order to announce a sham miracle, but it is very difficult to imagine men being tortured and killed for the truth of a miracle which they knew to be a sham. Okay, and here's Charles Colson. He was sort of with Nixon and Watergate, and he sort of became a very famous Christian afterwards. And here's what he said. I know the resurrection is a fact, and that Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, and they proclaimed that truth for 40 years and never once denied it. Every one of them was beaten and tortured and stoned and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it were not true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. So are you going to tell me that 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? That's absolutely impossible. Charles Colson. Okay, here is St. John Henry Newman. And John Henry Newman was a cardinal, and when he became a cardinal, he converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, and he was part of what was called the Oxford movement of Catholics in the 1800s, mid-1800s in England. Augustus Welby Pugin, the architect, was also part of that, as were many other famous preachers, and they later inspired people like G.K. Chesterton, for example, and Hilaire Belloc. Okay, so anyways, here's a quote by St. John Henry Newman. God has created me to do him some definite service. I shall do good. I shall do his work. I shall be a preacher of truth. And I think those are good words for a lot of people, for myself included. Okay, here's the Bible from John chapter 8, verse 32. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. All right, I hope that was helpful.